I think as I went through the research, probably the most surprising thing, to be honest, was to come to understand some of the deep-seated biases that I myself held. And I recognize that I'm probably not unique. So I think each of us probably has some pretty strongly held views about what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong, that we're not even really aware of, that we're bringing with us into the workplace. And I really had to learn to listen to why people were saying what they were saying, to understand how come their perspectives were equally valid, which I do believe that they are, but so very different from my own. I think one of the major examples is that boomers, I'm a boomer, grew up at a time when there were, frankly, a lot of boomers in a world that hadn't yet expanded to accommodate this large size cohort. Boomers have had to compete at every step in the game, and they've always known that there are 10 other boomers standing right there behind them, ready to jump into their chair if they falter. So boomers have this sense of drive and kind of almost relentless, I've got to be good, I've got to compete, that's very heavily baked into the way we approach things. Xers, on the other hand, grew up at a time when corporations were laying people off. They have a mistrust of institutions. They're much more likely to think about, how can I make sure I can keep a lot of options open? How could I take care of myself if something bad were to happen? So they're not really into playing that corporate game as much. They want to make sure that they themselves have the capabilities to respond in multiple situations. That kind of sense of, unstructuredness was something I found very odd, but very pervasive. Not necessarily expressed quite like that, but very pervasive in the interviews that I conducted with Xers. One of the really interesting things about Generation Y is that they trust authority. And they're the first generation in a couple of generations to do so. So most of the boomers grew up at a time when authority was not something you'd have a lot of respect for. They grew up questioning authority. And most of the Xers grew up in an environment where authority was just kind of something you didn't necessarily trust or respect. But the Ys, interestingly, love their parents, they love people their parents' age, and they tend to have great respect for anyone in positional authority, police, teachers, parents, friends, etc. But they're also very happy to pick up the phone and call the CEO and ask a question. So it's a new kind of respect for authority that we're seeing in companies today. One is count to 10. So in other words, don't jump to conclusions. When somebody reacts to a situation in the workplace in a way that you think is really strange, don't form the snap judgment that they're wrong, or that they're not committed, or they don't care, or all those kind of negative cycles that we can get ourselves worked into. Try to step back and understand where they're coming from. The second one, though, is don't assume that you could guess what they would want. I think one of the biggest mistakes boomers make with Xers is assuming that they're going to want the same career paths that we followed. So we'll go into their office and say, hey, I have great news. I've got you an opportunity to relocate, because to a boomer that would be great. It would mean we're being promoted and we're winning and we're moving forward. And an Xer is likely to say, but I don't want to relocate. And so they would have a very different reaction. Doesn't mean they're less committed, doesn't mean they're less valuable as employees, but they have a different relationship to institutions and a very different reaction, therefore, to an institution asking them to relocate. Once people get the idea of how valid it is for people to have different perspectives, most people rapidly extend that to all forms of diversity. And so it can have a wonderful effect in helping your executives, your team members, etc., grow as individuals in terms of their ability to work with a diverse population. Secondly, there are companies that are really looking at how to optimize around different generations. So how can we create programs that are well designed to attract and recruit Gen Ys? How can we retain our Gen Xers? What's going to be important? And so there's a lot from the research that really helps you understand, for example, what an optimum career path for most Gen Xers would look like compared to the old boomer models.